The towering butte cast a long shadow over the dusty main street of Copper Creek, Colorado, as Frances Owens hurried along the boardwalk, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders despite the summer heat of 1876. Not to ward off the non-existent chill, but to conceal what had made her an outcast in every town she'd ever lived in, the pronounced curve of her spine that had twisted her back into a permanent hunch since childhood. Frances kept her head down as she passed the general store, ignoring the whispers that followed her like unwelcome shadows. At 22, she had grown accustomed to the stares, the hushed comments, the mothers who pulled their children closer when she walked by as if her condition might be catching. But familiarity did nothing to dull the sting. "There she goes again," a woman's voice carried on the dry Colorado air. "Poor creature. Imagine living like that." Frances quickened her pace, clutching her basket of mended clothes tighter. As the town seamstress, her skilled hands kept her fed, even if her company wasn't welcomed beyond business transactions. The dress shop where she worked belonged to Mrs. Abigail Porter, perhaps the only person in town who treated Frances with anything approaching kindness, though even that relationship remained strictly professional. "Miss Owens," a child's voice called out. Frances tensed but turned to see young Tommy Wilson running toward her, a torn jacket in his hands. "Ma says, can you fix this by Saturday? Pa needs it for church." "Of course, Tommy," Frances replied, her voice soft as she took the garment. The boy didn't run away immediately, which surprised her. "Does it hurt?" he asked suddenly, eyes wide with curiosity. Frances knew what he meant. "No," she answered honestly. "Not usually." "Tommy Wilson," the sharp voice of Mrs. Wilson cut through the air. "Come away from there this instant." The boy scampered off, leaving Frances alone again. She sighed and continued toward the small room she rented at the back of the dress shop, her sanctuary from the world that had no place for her. That evening, as Frances worked by lamplight, the sound of commotion in the street drew her to the window. A cattle drive had arrived, and cowboys were filling the saloons and boarding houses. New faces meant new stares, new whispers. She pulled the curtain closed and returned to her sewing. At dawn, Frances rose early as always, preferring to complete her errands before most of the town awoke. The general store opened at first light to accommodate ranchers and farmers with long days ahead. As she approached, she noticed a tall figure leaning against the hitching post, hat pulled low. "Morning," a deep voice greeted her as she attempted to pass without drawing attention. Frances startled, unused to direct address from strangers. She glanced up briefly to see a man she didn't recognize, one of the cowboys from the cattle drive, no doubt. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened with stubble. "Good morning," she replied automatically, lowering her eyes again and quickening her pace. Inside the store, Mr. Jenkins greeted her with his usual businesslike nod. "Miss Owens, what can I get you today? Thread blue and black and some buttons, please." Frances kept her requests concise, aware of the cowboy who had followed her inside and was now examining a display of tobacco. As Mr. Jenkins gathered her items, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. A team of horses had spooked, and a wagon was careening down the street toward the store. The driver was desperately trying to regain control. Frances froze, her exit blocked by the approaching danger. Before she could react, strong arms encircled her waist, pulling her back just as the wagon crashed into a water trough outside, sending splintered wood and water spraying through the open doorway. "Are you all right?" The same deep voice from earlier was now close to her ear. The cowboy had pulled her to safety. Frances struggled to regain her composure, acutely aware of his hands on her waist and, worse, aware that he could surely feel the abnormal curve of her spine beneath his fingers. She pulled away quickly. "Thank you," she managed, keeping her eyes down. "I'm fine. Name's Hayes," he said, not moving away as she expected. "Hayes O'Malley." "Francis Owens," she replied reflexively, then immediately regretted offering her name, an invitation to conversation she didn't want. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Owens," Hayes said with a slight tip of his hat, revealing striking blue eyes beneath the brim. "Even under these circumstances." Frances nodded curtly and gathered her purchases, leaving payment on the counter before hurrying out the door, careful to avoid the wreckage outside. She could feel his eyes on her back as she departed, imagining the pity or revulsion that would surely be there if she turned around. For the next several days, Frances did her best to avoid the parts of town frequented by the visiting cowboys. She kept to her routine: work, errands at dawn or dusk, meals alone in her room. But Copper Creek was a small town, and avoiding someone determined to cross paths with her proved impossible. On the fourth day after their first meeting, Hayes O'Malley appeared at the back door of the dress shop, hat in hand. Frances was hanging laundry on the line and nearly dropped her basket when she saw him. "Miss Owens," he greeted her with a nod. "I was hoping to find you." Frances straightened as much as her back would allow, immediately on guard. "What can I do for you, Mr. O'Malley?" "I've torn my shirt something terrible," he said, holding up a bundle of fabric. "Caught it on a fence while rounding up some strays. Mrs. Porter said you're the finest seamstress in town." Frances hesitated, then extended her hand for the garment. "I can mend it. It will be ready tomorrow." "Much obliged," Hayes replied, but he made no move to leave. "I hear there's a social at the church on Saturday evening. Town tradition during cattle drives, they tell me." Frances concentrated on examining the tear in his shirt, refusing to acknowledge the implicit question. "The tear is quite extensive. I'll need to reinforce the seam." "Will you be attending the social, Miss Owens?" Hayes asked directly, his tone casual but determined. "No, Mr. O'Malley, I will not." Her response was firm. "Your shirt will be ready tomorrow afternoon. Good day." He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Tomorrow, then," he finally said, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you, Miss Owens." As Hayes walked away, Frances released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Men like him didn't talk to women like her without reason, and she'd learned long ago to be wary of attention. Either he was mocking her, or worse, pitying her. Neither was acceptable. That night, as Frances worked on Hayes's shirt by lamplight, she found herself examining it more carefully than necessary. The fabric was worn but clean, the stitching on the original seams neat and precise. Not a rich man's shirt, but one belonging to someone who took care of what he had. She found herself wondering about the man who wore it, then immediately chastised herself for the foolish thought. The next day, Hayes returned for his shirt precisely when she'd told him it would be ready. Frances had planned to leave it with Mrs. Porter to avoid another encounter, but a last-minute request from the mayor's wife had kept her late. "Fine work," Hayes commented, examining her stitches with genuine appreciation. "Can't even tell it was torn. What do I owe you?" 25 cents, Frances replied, maintaining a professional distance. Hayes placed 50 cents on the table. "Worth every penny and more." "That's too much," Frances protested. "Not for craftsmanship like this," Hayes insisted, already backing toward the door. "Thank you, Miss Owens." Before she could argue further, he was gone, leaving Frances staring at the coins on the table. She couldn't remember the last time someone had valued her work enough to pay extra without being asked. The church social came and went. Frances spent the evening alone in her room, listening to the distant sounds of music and laughter. On Sunday morning, She attended church as always, slipping into her usual seat at the back, just as the service began and leaving before the congregation could gather outside to socialize. Monday brought an unexpected development. As Frances was returning from delivering a completed dress to Mrs. Henderson at the far end of town, she spotted Hayes O'Malley sitting on the bench outside the dress shop, apparently waiting for her. "Mr. O'Malley," she acknowledged him cautiously. "Is there another repair you need?" Hayes stood, towering over her slight frame. "No, Miss Owens. I came to ask if you might join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening." Frances stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon, dinner," Hayes repeated. "I'd be honored if you'd accompany me." Frances felt heat rising to her cheeks along with a familiar defensive anger. "Is this some kind of joke, Mr. O'Malley? A wager with your friends, perhaps?" Confusion crossed Hayes's face. "No, madam, just dinner." "Then I must decline," Frances said firmly. "Good day, Mr. O'Malley." She brushed past him into the shop, closing the door with more force than necessary. Through the window, she watched him stand there for a long moment, looking genuinely puzzled before finally walking away. Mrs. Porter, who had witnessed the exchange, approached Frances with curiosity. "That cowboy has been asking about you, you know. Wanted to know if you had family in town, how long you've lived here." Frances continued sorting fabric, her movements stiff. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth. That you came here 3 years ago on your own, that you're the hardest worker I've ever employed, and that this town doesn't deserve your talents," Mrs. Porter replied matter-of-factly. He seemed most interested in that last part. "He's just passing through with the cattle drive," Frances said dismissively. "They'll be moving on soon enough." "Perhaps," Mrs. Porter agreed. "Though Mr. Jensen at the bank mentioned the Bar Cross Ranch is looking to hire experienced hands permanently. The drive was just bringing cattle to add to their existing herd." Frances said nothing more, but the information settled uncomfortably in her mind. Hayes O'Malley might not be leaving as quickly as she'd hoped. Over the next week, Hayes appeared with increasingly creative reasons to visit the dress shop. A button missing from his vest. A handkerchief that needed hemming. Each time, Frances maintained her professional distance, completing the work quickly and efficiently, accepting payment with minimal conversation. On his 5th visit, Hayes tried a different approach. "Miss Owens, I get the feeling you're avoiding conversation with me." Frances paused in her work, needle poised mid-stitch. "I'm simply focused on my work, Mr. O'Malley." "Then perhaps you might focus on answering a question for me," he continued undeterred. "Why won't you have dinner with me? Is there someone else, a sweetheart or husband I don't know about?" Frances almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "No, Mr. O'Malley, there is no one else." "Then why?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. Frances set down her sewing and finally looked him full in the face. "Because I don't understand what game you're playing, and I have no interest in being its subject." Hayes held her gaze steadily. "No game, Miss Owens. Just a man asking a woman to dinner." "Men like you don't ask women like me to dinner without reason," Frances stated plainly. "Women like you." Hayes echoed, his brow furrowing. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning." Frances stood abruptly, her patience exhausted. "Don't pretend, Mr. O'Malley. I've lived with this back my entire life. I know what people see when they look at me. I know the whispers, the stares, the mockery. Whatever your purpose in pursuing this charade, I want no part of it." Hayes was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Miss Owens, I came to Copper Creek with a cattle drive. I've accepted a permanent position at the Bar Cross Ranch. I'm 28 years old. I've never been married. I enjoy fishing at sunrise and reading by lamplight. I make a decent living and hope to have a home of my own someday." He paused. "These are facts about me that might interest a woman I'm courting. Would you like to know more?" Francis stared at him, speechless. "Because I would very much like to know more about you," Hayes continued gently. "Not about your back or what others whisper about. About you, Frances Owens, the woman who sews with such skill her stitches are nearly invisible, who attends church alone each Sunday, who rises before dawn to avoid crowds." "Why?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. Hayes took a step closer. "Because when I look at you, I'm looking at your heart, Miss Owens, and everything I've seen so far tells me it's worth knowing better." Francis felt tears threatening and turned away quickly. "I think you should go, Mr. O'Malley." To her surprise, he respected her request. "I'll go. But I'll be back, Miss Owens, unless you tell me directly and honestly that you have no interest in knowing me better." When she didn't respond, he nodded once and left the shop. Francis remained standing in the middle of the workroom, trembling slightly, his words echoing in her mind. That night, Francis barely slept. Hayes's declaration had unsettled everything she thought she understood about her place in the world. Since childhood, she had accepted that certain paths were closed to her marriage, family, the simple joy of being seen as a woman rather than an affliction. She had built a life within those limitations, finding satisfaction in her work if not happiness in her solitude. And now this stranger, this cowboy with clear blue eyes and direct speech, had walked into her carefully constructed world and suggested the limitations might not be as fixed as she believed. The next morning, Frances rose even earlier than usual, needing the quiet streets to think. As she passed the livery stable, she was startled to see Hayes emerging, leading a saddled horse. He spotted her immediately. "Miss Owens," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "You're up with the birds." "As are you," she observed, stopping despite her better judgment. "Heading up to check fence lines for the ranch," he explained. "Best done before the day gets too hot." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you care to join me? Just for a short ride. We'd be back before the town wakes." Francis felt a flutter of panic. "I don't ride, Mr. O'Malley." "Have you ever tried?" When she shook her head, he smiled. "Then how do you know you can't?" "I didn't say I can't," Francis clarified, irritation creeping into her voice. "I said I don't." Hayes's smile widened. "A very important distinction. Would you like to learn?" Francis was about to refuse when a reckless impulse seized her. What did she have to lose? Her dignity. The town already saw her as an object of pity, her safety. Perhaps, but the alternative was the safety of continued isolation. "Very well, Mr. O'Malley," she heard herself say. "A short ride." Hayes's expression brightened with genuine pleasure. "I'll saddle another horse. Give me 5 minutes." As he disappeared into the stable, Francis fought the urge to flee. What was she thinking? She had never been on a horse in her life. Her back made many physical activities difficult or painful. And yet, the prospect of doing something so normal, so ordinary as riding out at dawn with a handsome cowboy was intoxicating in its impossibility. Hayes returned leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with a dappled gray coat. "This is Daisy," he introduced. "Steadiest horse in the stable. She'll take good care of you." With patience and careful instruction, Hayes helped Frances mount, adjusting the stirrups and showing her how to hold the reins. To her surprise, sitting astride the horse was not as uncomfortable as she had feared. The mare stood perfectly still, as if sensing her rider's nervousness. "Ready?" Hayes asked, mounting his own horse with practiced ease. Frances nodded, unable to trust her voice. As Daisy began to walk forward, following Hayes's horse, she gripped the saddle horn tightly. They rode at a walk out of town, Hayes keeping a careful eye on her progress. As they reached the open rangeland beyond Copper Creek, the early morning sun crested the distant mountains, bathing the landscape in golden light. "All right," Hayes checked, riding alongside her now. "Yes," Francis replied, surprised to find it was true. The rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her was becoming more familiar, less frightening. "It's peaceful." "That it is," Hayes agreed, looking out at the vast expanse of land. "That's what drew me to ranching. The space to breathe, to think." They rode in companionable silence for a while, Hayes occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about his experiences on cattle drives. Frances found herself relaxing, drawn into conversation more naturally than she had experienced in years. "What brought you to Copper Creek?" Hayes asked as they paused atop a small rise, the town visible in the distance. Frances considered deflecting the question, as she usually did when people inquired about her past. Instead, she found herself answering honestly. "Necessity. I was working in Denver, but the dressmaker I apprenticed with died. Her family sold the business. The new owner had other ideas about my role." She swallowed hard. "I left that night with what I could carry. Copper Creek was as far as my money would take me by stage." Hayes's expression darkened. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "It's not the worst thing," Frances said simply. "I found work here. Mrs. Porter is fair if not overly warm. I have a roof and meals." "Is that enough for you?" Hayes asked quietly. "Work and shelter." Frances looked away, uncomfortable with the directness of his question. "It has to be." "No," Hayes said firmly. "It doesn't have to be." Before Frances could respond, a rabbit darted across their path, startling Daisy. The mare sidestepped suddenly, and Frances, unprepared, lost her balance. She slid sideways in the saddle, a cry of alarm escaping her as she felt herself falling. In an instant, Hayes was there, his arm catching her before she hit the ground. The sudden movement sent a sharp pain through her twisted spine, and Frances gasped. "Are you hurt?" Hayes asked urgently, helping her to stand, his hands steady on her waist. "Just startled," Frances assured him, though she couldn't hide the wince as she straightened. "And perhaps a bit sore." Hayes's face was etched with concern. "I should have been more careful. First rides are always tricky." "It's not your fault," Frances said, embarrassed by the incident. "I wasn't paying attention." Hayes kept one arm around her waist, supporting her. "Can you ride back, or shall I help you onto my horse? I can lead Daisy." The proximity was overwhelming, his arm around her, his face close to hers, blue eyes filled with genuine concern rather than the pity she was accustomed to seeing. Frances felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. "I can ride," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But thank you." With Hayes's help, she remounted, and they returned to town at a slow walk. The streets were beginning to fill as they reached the livery stable. Frances was acutely aware of the stares and whispers as Hayes helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for the riding lesson, Mr. O'Malley," Frances said formally, conscious of watching eyes. "Hayes," he corrected gently. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Owens." "Frances," she offered in return, surprising herself. His smile was worth the risk of the unfamiliar intimacy. "Frances," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "Would you consider having dinner with me now, perhaps this evening?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities Frances had long ago stopped allowing herself to imagine. She took a deep breath. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that." The smile that spread across Hayes's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll call for you at 6, he said. "And Frances, thank you for taking a chance on a dusty cowboy." As Hayes led the horses back to the stable, Frances made her way to the dress shop, feeling the stares of townspeople following her. For the first time in years, she didn't hunch her shoulders against their judgment. Let them stare. Let them wonder. For once, their whispers couldn't touch her. The hours until evening passed in a blur of needle and thread, though Frances found her usually steady hands betraying her with small mistakes that required ripping out and redoing stitches. Mrs. Porter observed her unusual distraction with raised eyebrows but made no comment until closing time approached. "You have plans this evening?" the older woman asked as Frances put away her work earlier than usual. "Yes," Frances admitted. "Dinner." Mrs. Porter's eyebrows rose higher. "With the cowboy, I presume?" "The one who's been finding excuses to visit my shop daily," Frances nodded, feeling color rise to her cheeks. To her surprise, Mrs. Porter smiled, a rare sight. "Good. About time someone in this town showed sense enough to see beyond the surface." She hesitated, then added, "You might want to wear your blue dress. It brings out your eyes." Frances stared after her employer as the woman retreated to the front of the shop. In 3 years, it was perhaps the most personal remark Mrs. Porter had ever made to her. In her small room, Frances carefully dressed in her best outfit, the blue dress Mrs. Porter had mentioned, which she had made herself from fabric remnants. She washed her face and brushed her hair until it shone, pinning it up in a simple but neat style. Looking in her small mirror, she tried to see herself as Hayes might see her, not focusing on the curve of her spine but on her eyes, her smile, the person she was beneath the physical form that had defined her for so long. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock came at the back door of the shop. Frances took a deep breath and opened it to find Hayes standing there, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes, his hat in his hands. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his eyes warm with admiration. Frances couldn't remember the last time someone had called her beautiful. She wasn't sure anyone ever had. "Thank you," she managed. "You look very nice as well." Hayes offered his arm. "Shall we?" As they walked down the main street toward the hotel restaurant, Frances was acutely aware of the stares they attracted. Hayes, tall and straight-backed beside her hunched form, seemed not to notice or care. "People are watching," Frances murmured, fighting the urge to pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Hayes glanced down at her, his expression serious. "Let them. I'm proud to be walking with you." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Copper Creek, catering to travelers and the town's upper echelon. As Hayes held the door for Frances, she caught sight of Mayor Jenkins and his wife at a corner table. "Mrs." Jenkins's eyes widened in surprise, and she leaned over to whisper something to her husband. Hayes led Frances to a table by the window and held her chair. The waiter approached, his professional demeanor slipping momentarily as he registered Frances's identity. "Good evening," Hayes said firmly. "We'll have your best table wine, please, and whatever the chef recommends for dinner." The waiter nodded and retreated, leaving them alone. Frances fidgeted with her napkin, suddenly uncertain what to say. In her limited experience, men engaged her in conversation only to discuss business repairs needed, payments offered. Social discourse was unfamiliar territory. "Have you always been a seamstress?" Hayes asked, breaking the silence. Grateful for the opening, Frances nodded. "My mother taught me to sew when I was very young. She said my hands were gifted, even if my back was not." The memory brought a small smile to her lips. She believed everyone had gifts to offer the world. "A wise woman," Hayes observed. "What happened to your parents, if you don't mind my asking?" "Influenza," Frances replied. "I was 16. They had a small tailor shop in St. Louis. After they died, the landlord claimed they owed back rent and seized everything. I had no choice but to find employment elsewhere." Hayes's expression darkened. "That sounds convenient for the landlord." "Life is rarely fair," Frances said without bitterness. "I've learned to make my way regardless." "That you have," Hayes agreed, admiration clear in his voice. "Tell me more about your work. Mrs. Porter says you're the finest seamstress she's ever employed." The conversation flowed more easily as they discussed her craft, Hayes showing genuine interest in the technical aspects of dressmaking. By the time their food arrived, Frances found herself relaxing, even laughing at Hayes's stories of mishaps during cattle drives. And then the cook, cantankerous old fellow named Beans, he pulls out his shotgun and threatens to shoot the next man who complains about his biscuits, Hayes recounted, eyes twinkling with mirth. Never seen cowboys eat so fast and with such enthusiastic compliments. Frances laughed, the sound surprising her with its freedom. Did his cooking improve? Not a bit, Hayes admitted, but our manners sure did. As they finished their meal, Hayes grew more serious. "I should tell you, I've accepted that permanent position at Bar Cross Ranch. Foreman offered it yesterday." "Congratulations," Frances said sincerely. "You seem pleased." "I am," Hayes confirmed. "Been drifting long enough, time to put down some roots." He hesitated, then reached across the table to touch her hand lightly. "Frances, I know we've only just begun to know each other, but I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not a man who plays games with a woman's feelings. When I said I was looking at your heart, I meant it." Frances felt her pulse quicken at his touch, at the earnestness in his eyes. "Hayes, you don't need to say anything now," he interrupted gently. "Just know that I see you, all of you, and what I see is a woman of strength, dignity, and grace. A woman I'd like to court properly if she's willing." Frances looked down at his hand covering hers, weathered and strong. "People will talk," she said softly. "They already are," Hayes shrugged. "Let them. Their opinions don't matter to me." "They might come to matter," Frances countered. "Over time, the stares, the whispers they wear on you. Are you trying to warn me off, Frances Owens?" Hayes asked, a hint of challenge in his voice. "I'm being realistic," she replied. "My back won't change. The way people see me won't change." "Maybe not," Hayes acknowledged, "but how you see yourself might. How I see you already does change how you move through the world. I watched you walk down the street tonight with your head high for the first time since I've known you." Frances hadn't realized the truth of his observation until he spoke it aloud. She had walked differently tonight with him beside her. "One dinner doesn't change a lifetime," she said softly. "No," Hayes agreed, "but it can be a beginning." As they left the restaurant, the night air had cooled, bringing relief from the summer heat. Hayes offered Frances his arm again, and she took it, allowing him to guide her through the darkened streets toward the dress shop. "May I call on you tomorrow?" Hayes asked as they reached her door. Frances hesitated only briefly. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I would like that." Hayes smiled, then bent slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. "Good night, Frances. Thank you for a lovely evening." As Frances prepared for bed that night, her cheek still tingling from the brief touch of his lips, she allowed herself to consider possibilities she had long ago dismissed as impossible. Could someone truly see beyond her physical form to the woman beneath? Could Hayes O'Malley be that someone? For the first time in years, Frances fell asleep with hope blossoming in her heart. The following weeks brought a transformation to Frances's quiet existence. True to his word, Hayes called on her regularly, undeterred by the curious stares and whispers that followed them through town. They established a routine, riding at dawn on Sundays before church, Frances improving steadily under Hayes's patient instruction. Dinner at the hotel on Wednesday evenings, and walks along the creek on Saturday afternoons. As summer gave way to autumn, Frances found herself changing in ways she hadn't anticipated. She stood straighter, not physically, for her back remained as it had always been but in spirit. She met the gazes of townspeople directly now, no longer hiding behind downcast eyes and hunched shoulders. Some responded with surprise, others with discomfort, but a few, like Dr. Morgan's wife and the baker, Mr. Schmidt, began to greet her warmly when she passed. "You're different, Mrs. Porter observed one afternoon as Frances hummed while working on an elaborate wedding dress for the banker's daughter. Frances looked up, needle poised mid-stitch. "Different, happier," Mrs. Porter clarified. "It suits you." Before Frances could respond, the shop bell jingled, signaling a customer. Mrs. Porter went to attend to them, leaving Frances to consider her words. Was she happier? Undeniably. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt seen, valued for more than just her skilled hands. Yet beneath the happiness lurked fear that this newfound joy was temporary, that Hayes would eventually see what everyone else saw when they looked at her. Each day that passed without that happening both strengthened her hope and heightened her anxiety about its inevitable end. That Saturday, as they walked along the creek where aspens were turning golden in the September air, Hayes seemed unusually quiet. "Is something troubling you?" Frances finally asked as they paused to rest on a fallen log. Hayes turned to face her, his expression serious. "I received a letter from my brother in Kansas yesterday. Our father is ill, heart troubles. The doctor doesn't give him long." "Oh, Hayes, I'm so sorry," Frances said, instinctively reaching for his hand. "I need to go to him," Hayes continued, his fingers tightening around hers. "Family is—" "Well, it's all we really have in the end, isn't it?" Frances nodded, understanding all too well the value of family when it was gone. "When will you leave?" "Tomorrow, after church," Hayes replied. "The foreman's given me a month's leave. I've saved enough to make the journey and back." The word "back" eased the immediate tightness in Frances's chest, but another worry quickly replaced it. Will you tell them about me?" The question emerged barely above a whisper. Hayes studied her face, his blue eyes serious. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll tell them about the remarkable woman I've met, who sews like an angel and laughs like she's just discovered the joy of it. I'll tell them how she's brave enough to get back on a horse after falling, and kind enough to mend Tommy Wilson's jacket at half price because his family is struggling." His hand reached up to touch her cheek gently. "And yes, I'll tell them about your back because it's part of what makes you who you are, but it won't be the first thing I mention, or the second, or even the 10th. Tears welled in Frances's eyes. "And if they object? If they think their son deserves better, then they'll be wrong," Hayes said firmly. "But they won't object. My mother raised us to judge people by their actions and their hearts, not their appearances. My father may be gruff, but he married a woman everyone thought was too educated and opinionated for her own good. He understands loving someone the world doesn't understand." Frances felt a flutter at his use of the word loving, but before she could respond, Hayes reached into his pocket and withdrew a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I got you something," he said, suddenly looking nervous. "Something to remember me by while I'm gone." Frances carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small silver locket on a delicate chain. It was simple but beautifully crafted, with a subtle floral pattern etched on its surface. "It opens," Hayes prompted softly. Inside, she found a tiny pressed flower, a mountain bluebell, the same kind that had been blooming along the creek when they first began their Saturday walks. "Hayes," Frances breathed, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful." "Like the woman who wears it," he said, then cleared his throat as if embarrassed by his own sentimentality. "May I?" Frances nodded, and Hayes gently fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. When he finished, he didn't move away immediately, his face close to hers. "Francis," he said softly, "I know it hasn't been long, but I hope you know what you've come to mean to me." Francis met his gaze steadily, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Show me," she whispered. Hayes needed no further invitation. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Francis responded with the inexperience of someone who had never been kissed before, but what she lacked in technique, she made up for in genuine emotion. When they finally parted, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I'll come back to you," he promised. "You have my word." "I'll be waiting," Francis replied, her fingers closing around the locket at her throat. The following day, after church services, Francis stood at the edge of town, watching as Hayes mounted his horse for the long journey to Kansas. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that had become so familiar it made her heart ache at the thought of its absence in the coming weeks. "1 month," he called. "Look for me when the first snow falls." Then he was gone, riding eastward, the dust settling behind him on the road out of Copper Creek. Francis touched the locket at her throat and turned back toward town, already counting the days until his return. The first week of Hayes's absence passed slowly, each day stretching endlessly before Francis as she settled back into her solitary routine. She wore the locket constantly, finding comfort in its weight against her skin. On the 8th day, as Francis was delivering a completed dress to Mrs. Henderson, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Can you imagine?" Mrs. Wilson was saying to the pharmacist's wife. "A man like that, courting the hunchback. His family will surely put an end to it once they see her. No mother wants grandchildren with such afflictions." "Perhaps he doesn't intend marriage at all," the pharmacist's wife suggested with a knowing look. "Men have other arrangements sometimes." "Either way," Mrs. Wilson continued, "I expect he'll return with a clearer perspective on what's suitable, if he returns at all." Francis hurried past without being noticed, her chest tight with pain that had nothing to do with her spine. The women had merely given voice to her own deepest fears she had temporarily allowed Hayes to quiet, but which had never truly left her. That night, alone in her room, Francis removed the locket for the first time since Hayes had placed it around her neck. She held it in her palm, staring at its silvery surface until it blurred through her tears. Was she a fool to believe someone could truly want her? Not just for her skilled hands or for some temporary amusement, but for a lifetime. The following morning, Francis rose before dawn as always, but instead of heading directly to the dress shop, she made her way to the creek where she and Hayes had walked so many times. The aspens were nearly bare now, their golden leaves carpeting the ground. The first frost of the season had edged the creek with delicate ice crystals that glittered in the early light. Francis sat on their fallen log and closed her eyes, trying to recapture the feeling of Hayes's lips on hers, the certainty in his voice when he promised to return. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer alone. "Thought I might find you here," Mrs. Porter said, approaching with uncharacteristic hesitation. "You weren't at the shop." "I needed to think," Francis replied, surprised by the older woman's presence. In 3 years, Mrs. Porter had never sought her out beyond business matters. Mrs. Porter sat beside her on the log, her movements stiff with age and the morning chill. "I heard what those women said yesterday. Gossip travels fast in small towns." Francis tensed. "It doesn't matter, doesn't it, Mrs. Porter asked quietly. "It seemed to matter enough to bring you out here at first light." When Francis didn't respond, Mrs. Porter continued. "I was married once, did you know that?" When Francis shook her head, she nodded. 23 years to a good man named James Porter. He died in a mining accident before we came to Copper Creek." "I'm sorry," Francis said automatically. The thing about James, Mrs. Porter continued as if she hadn't spoken, was that he was nearly blind in one eye and had a limp from a childhood illness. His own mother told me I could do better. She laughed, a short, harsh sound. Can you imagine? As if her son was somehow less deserving of love because he wasn't perfect. Frances turned to look at her employer with new interest. What did you do? I married him anyway, Mrs. Porter said simply. Had 15 happy years before the accident, never regretted a single day. She paused, then added, People will always talk, Frances. The question is whether you'll let their talk decide your life. With that, she stood and headed back toward town, leaving Frances to consider her words. 2 more weeks passed, autumn deepening toward winter. Frances threw herself into her work, completing orders ahead of schedule, and even accepting a commission to create a wedding dress for a bride in the next town over a challenge that required all her skill and concentration. As she worked, she found herself watching the sky anxiously, noting the increasing chill in the air and the gathering clouds that promised the season's first snowfall. Hayes had said to look for him when the first snow came. Would he keep that promise? On the 26th day of Hayes's absence, Frances woke to a world transformed. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing Copper Creek in pristine white. Her heart leaped at the sight, then immediately constricted with anxiety. Would today be the day? She dressed with special care, choosing her blue dress despite the cold, adding a heavy shawl for warmth. The locket, which she had continued to wear despite her fears, lay cool against her skin. At the dress shop, Mrs. Porter took one look at her and smiled knowingly. Go, she said, gesturing toward the door. The Henderson order can wait a day. Frances hesitated. But what if go, Mrs. Porter repeated firmly. Wait at your creek. I'll send word if he comes to town first. Gratefully, Frances wrapped herself in her warmest cloak and made her way through the snow-covered streets to the path leading to the creek. The journey was more difficult in the snow, especially with her uneven gait, but she persevered, driven by a hope she couldn't quite suppress despite her lingering doubts. At the creek, everything was transformed by winter's first touch. Ice had claimed the water's edge, and the bare branches of the aspens were outlined in white. Frances brushed snow from their fallen log and sat down to wait, pulling her cloak tighter against the chill. Hours passed. The weak winter sun climbed toward its zenith, then began its early descent toward the mountains. Frances's fingers and toes grew numb with cold, but still she waited, her hope fading with the daylight. As shadows lengthened across the snow, Frances finally accepted that Hayes would not come today. Perhaps tomorrow, she told herself. Perhaps he had been delayed by weather or family obligations. Perhaps, whispered a darker voice in her mind, he wasn't coming back at all. With a heavy heart, she rose to return to town before darkness made the path treacherous. As she turned, movement at the far end of the clearing caught her eye. A rider approaching slowly through the trees, his figure dark against the white landscape. Frances's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. She stood frozen, watching as the rider drew nearer, not daring to hope until she could make out his features beneath his snow-dusted hat. Frances! Hayes's voice carried across the clearing, and then he was dismounting, moving toward her with long strides that left tracks in the virgin snow. You came, she whispered as he reached her, scarcely believing her eyes. I promised I would, Hayes replied, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. His face was leaner than when he'd left, lined with fatigue from the journey, but his eyes were as clear and blue as ever, fixed on her with unmistakable joy. Your father? Frances asked anxiously. Recovering, Hayes said, relief evident in his voice. The doctor was wrong, thank God. A change in diet and less work seems to be helping. I'm glad, Frances said sincerely. And your family, did you tell them about me? Hayes's expression softened. I did. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper, similar to the one that had contained her locket. My mother sent this for you. With trembling fingers, Frances unwrapped the parcel to reveal a delicate handkerchief embroidered with bluebells that matched the one in her locket. In the corner, elegant stitches spelled out "Welcome to the family with love." Tears filled Frances's eyes. She hasn't even met me, she whispered. She knows what matters, Hayes said simply. That you make her son happier than he's ever been. Hayes took her cold hands in his warm ones. Frances Owens, I've had a month to think about what I want to say to you, and now that I'm standing here, words seem inadequate. He dropped to one knee in the snow, still holding her hands. I love you. Not despite your back or because of it, but because of who you are, your strength, your kindness, your determination. I want to spend my life with you if you'll have me. Frances stared down at him, this man kneeling before her in the snow as if she were the most precious thing in his world. All her life, she had been defined by what she lacked: a straight spine, a normal appearance, the ability to blend into a crowd without drawing stares. Now, for the first time, she was being defined by what she offered: love, companionship, herself. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Yes, Hayes O'Malley, I will marry you. Hayes's face broke into a radiant smile as he rose and pulled her into his arms, lifting her feet off the ground in his enthusiasm. His lips found hers in a kiss that warmed her more thoroughly than any fire could have done. When he finally set her down, Hayes brushed a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. My mother wants us to be married in Kansas, with the family present. But I told her that decision was yours to make. If you'd prefer to marry here or somewhere else entirely, we'll do that instead. Frances considered the question seriously. What about the Bar Cross Ranch? Won't they expect you back? They'll hold my position until spring, Hayes explained. I've earned that much with my work this summer. And when we return, the foreman has promised us use of the old homestead on the property. It needs work, but it would be ours, Frances finished for him, the idea of a home, their home, filling her with wonder. Yes, Hayes confirmed. Ours. Frances touched the locket at her throat, then looked up at the man who had seen her heart when no one else had bothered to look. I think I would like to meet your family, she decided. To thank your mother in person for her gift and to see where you came from. Hayes smiled. Then Kansas it is. We can leave after Christmas, if that suits you. The travel will be easier once the passes clear a bit. As they walked back toward town together, the snow began falling again, soft flakes catching in Hayes's dark hair and on Frances's eyelashes. The path was difficult, but Hayes matched his stride to hers, never hurrying her or drawing attention to her uneven gait. It was, Frances realized, a perfect metaphor for the life they would build together, a journey taken at their own pace, side by side. In Copper Creek, the news of their engagement spread quickly. Some, like Mrs. Porter and Dr. Morgan, offered sincere congratulations. Others whispered behind their hands, predicting disaster or suggesting improper motives. Frances found that increasingly she didn't care. The opinions that had once shaped her world now seemed inconsequential compared to the certainty she felt in Hayes's love. They were married 2 months later in a small church in Lawrence, Kansas, surrounded by Hayes's family, his recovering father, his warm-hearted mother, and 2 brothers with their wives and children. Frances, who had expected to feel self-conscious and out of place, instead found herself embraced with genuine affection. Thank you for loving my son, Hayes's mother whispered as she helped Frances prepare for the ceremony. and for letting him love you. Some people never find what you two have found. The wedding was simple but joyful. Frances wore a dress she had made herself, designed to accommodate her back while emphasizing her best features. As she walked down the aisle on Mr. O'Malley's arm, she held her head high, her eyes fixed on Hayes waiting for her at the altar. When the minister asked who gave this woman in marriage, Mr. O'Malley's voice rang out clear and strong. Her parents in spirit and my wife and I with great joy. Hayes took her hands as she reached him, his eyes never leaving hers as they spoke their vows. When he lifted her veil to kiss her as his wife, Frances saw nothing but love in his gaze, not pity, not accommodation, but genuine adoration. "Mrs. O'Malley," he whispered against her lips, and Frances felt her heart expand with happiness so intense it was almost painful. Spring found them returning to Colorado, to the promised homestead on Bar Cross land. The cabin was indeed in need of work. The roof leaked, the porch sagged, and the windows rattled in their frames, but it stood on a beautiful piece of land with the mountains visible in the distance and a small creek running nearby. "What do you think?" Hayes asked anxiously as they approached on horseback. "It's not much yet, but it's perfect," Frances interrupted, already envisioning curtains at the windows and flowers along the path. "Absolutely perfect." Over the next months, they worked together to make the homestead their own. Hayes repaired the structural issues while Frances transformed the interior with simple, tasteful touches. She continued to sew, taking commissions from ranching families in the area who were delighted to have access to her skills without traveling to town. Copper Creek was close enough to visit occasionally for supplies, but far enough that its whispers couldn't reach them. When they did venture into town, Frances noted with satisfaction that the stares had diminished. She was no longer simply the Hunchback, but Mrs. O'Malley, the talented seamstress from Bar Cross. A year after their wedding, as summer bloomed across the rangeland, Frances shared news that filled Hayes with incandescent joy. "A baby," he breathed, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Are you sure?" Frances nodded, her own happiness tempered with anxiety. "Dr. Morgan says my back shouldn't complicate things too badly, but the delivery will be difficult. And Hayes, the baby might be perfect," Hayes finished for her, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Or might have your spine, or my father's weak heart, or any number of things we can't predict. But whatever comes, we'll face it together." 7 months later, Frances gave birth to a son after a labor that tested the limits of her endurance. Hayes paced outside the bedroom door as Dr. Morgan and the midwife worked through the night, his prayers a continuous stream as he listened to his wife's muffled cries. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, a new cry joined Frances's, the lusty wail of a newborn announcing his arrival in the world. "You have a son, Mr. O'Malley," the midwife announced, opening the door to admit him. "And a very brave wife." Hayes entered the bedroom to find Frances pale but triumphant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. "Come meet your son," she whispered. "He's perfect, Hayes. Absolutely perfect." Hayes sat carefully on the edge of the bed and peered at the tiny face nestled against Frances's breast. Their son had a shock of dark hair like his father's, and when he opened them briefly, eyes that promised to be the same clear blue. His back was straight, his limbs strong and well-formed. "James," Hayes suggested softly, recalling Mrs. Porter's story of her beloved husband. "James Porter O'Malley." Frances smiled, pleased by the tribute to the woman who had become a surrogate mother to her in the years since. "James," she agreed. "It suits him." As Hayes watched his wife nursing their newborn son, he felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. This extraordinary woman had given him not only her love, but now a family of his own. When he had told her that first day that he was looking at her heart, he couldn't have known how truly magnificent that heart would prove to be. "I love you," he said simply, the words inadequate to express the depth of his feeling. Frances looked up at him, her face alight with the same emotion. "And I love you, Hayes O'Malley. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." In the years that followed, the O'Malley family flourished. James was joined by a sister, Sarah, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, William. The homestead expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Hayes adding rooms as needed and Frances making each one a warm, welcoming space. Frances's sewing business grew as well, her reputation spreading throughout the county. Hayes rose to become head foreman at Bar Cross, respected for his fairness and skill with both cattle and men. As their children grew, Frances watched anxiously for signs that any of them might develop her spinal condition, but all three remained healthy and straight-backed. Still, she and Hayes made sure the children understood that a person's worth came from their character, not their appearance. "Your mama has the strongest back I know," Hayes would tell them when they were old enough to notice their mother's difference. "It carries more love and courage than most folks manage in a lifetime." When James was 10, an incident at school tested this teaching. He came home with a bloody nose and torn shirt, having gotten into a fight with a boy who had mocked Frances in the schoolyard. "He called you a name," James explained, his young face fierce with protective love. "Said mean things about your back." Frances cleaned her son's face gently while Hayes looked on with a mixture of pride and concern. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him my mama's back might be bent, but her heart is straighter and truer than anyone else's," James replied. "Then I hit him." Hayes coughed to hide a laugh, earning a reproving look from Frances. "Violence isn't the answer, James," she said firmly, "though I appreciate the sentiment behind it." "What is the answer then, Mama?" the boy asked seriously. Frances considered the question carefully. "Living well," she finally said. "Being happy despite what others might think or say. That's the best revenge against cruelty, refusing to let it diminish you." It was a philosophy she had come to embrace fully in the 15 years since Hayes had first told her he was looking at her heart. The hunch in her back remained, of course, but it had ceased to define her, becoming simply one aspect of a life rich with love, purpose, and joy. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Hayes presented Frances with a gift, a rocking chair custom-made to accommodate her back, allowing her to sit comfortably for long periods while she sewed or read to their children. "I had it made in Denver," he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth wood. "The craftsman is known for making furniture for people with special needs." Frances sank into the chair, marveling at how perfectly it supported her. "It's wonderful, Hayes. Thank you." Hayes knelt beside the chair, taking her hand in his as he had on the day he proposed. At 43, his dark hair was now threaded with silver, and lines of experience had deepened around his eyes, but his gaze was as clear and loving as ever. 15 years ago, I promised to love you for a lifetime," he said softly. "I hope I've kept that promise so far." Frances touched his face gently, mapping the familiar contours with her fingers. "Every day," she assured him. "Every single day." Outside, their children's laughter rang across the homestead as they played in the summer twilight. Inside, in the home they had built together, Hayes leaned forward to kiss his wife, still looking as he always had directly at her heart. In the autumn of their lives, when their children had grown and begun families of their own, Frances and Hayes remained at the homestead, surrounded by memories and the fruits of their shared labor. The Bar Cross Ranch had prospered under Hayes's management, and when he finally retired, the owners gifted them the deed to their land in recognition of his decades of service. Frances continued to sew well into her 60s, though she limited her work to special projects: christening gowns for grandchildren, wedding dresses for young women in the community, repair work on cherished heirlooms. Her hands remained nimble despite the years, and her reputation as an artist with needle and thread had long since overshadowed any whispers about her back. On cool evenings, they would sit together on the porch Hayes had built, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. Sometimes they spoke of the future, of their hopes for their grandchildren or plans for the coming seasons. More often, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes only after a lifetime of shared words. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't stopped in Copper Creek with that cattle drive? Frances asked one such evening, her hand resting in his. Hayes considered the question seriously, as he did all questions from his wife. "I suppose I'd have found another town, another ranch," he said finally. "But I'd have been missing something essential all my life without knowing what it was." Frances smiled, understanding his meaning without need for elaboration. "I might have remained at Mrs. Porter's shop, sewing other women's wedding dresses until I was too old to thread a needle." "A tragic waste," Hayes declared, bringing her hand to his lips. "Of the finest heart I've ever known." As twilight deepened into night, Frances leaned against her husband's shoulder, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From a young woman who hid from the world's stares to the matriarch of a thriving family, respected and loved throughout the community. From a lonely cowboy drifting with cattle drives to the foundation of a legacy that would continue through their children and grandchildren. All because one man had looked past what everyone else saw to recognize the truth. That sometimes the most beautiful hearts beat in the most unlikely bodies. And that love, when it's genuine, sees beyond the surface to the essence beneath. "I'm still looking at your heart, Frances O'Malley," Hayes murmured, as if reading her thoughts. "And it's still the most beautiful sight these old eyes have ever seen." Under a sky full of stars, Frances closed her eyes and leaned into the embrace of the man who had taught her that physical forms might be flawed. But love, true love, was perfect in its acceptance, unwavering in its commitment, and limitless in its capacity to transform lives. In that moment, as in all the moments that had brought them here, Frances knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her back might be bent, but her heart was held safe in the hands of the man who had seen its worth when no one else had bothered to look.